For one long weekend in August, the gardens, the cellars and the attics of Britain's three royal palaces were invaded by hordes of archaeologists and historical investigators. It had started with a right royal invitation.
We're going to dig up everything.
And it ended with some right royal discoveries. A handful of lost buildings, one of them the most significant medieval structure uncovered in recent years. Everyday finds from the royal back gardens and the entire history of the site of Buckingham Palace. It was a right royal triumph.
That is what I call a real find.
We're going to look back at an extraordinary summer weekend when Time Team were allowed unprecedented access to excavate at three royal palaces. Windsor Castle, the oldest occupied castle in the world, Holyrood House, the Queen's Palace in Scotland, and the headquarters of the family firm, Buckingham Palace. We spent the long weekend digging up all three of them. You'll see the highs and the lows, from more than 20 hours of spade-by-spade, trowel-by-trowel live television as we made the most of our few days, let loose with royal approval. This is how it all started. Welcome to the Big Royal Dig. We've never had the opportunity to dig up a lawn as big as this before, and as ever, anything could turn up. Mostly on Time Team, we get to investigate sites where, very briefly, hundreds of years ago, something happened of historical interest. But this weekend is rather different. The palaces span nearly 1,000 years of royal history. Together, they've been home to 8 separate dynasties. We were determined to understand how all three of these palaces came to be built, how they'd evolved, and how today they reflect their extraordinary histories. At Windsor, Tessa Dunlop and Alice Roberts were leading the team at the Queen's favourite residence. They seemed quite excited at the prospect.
Here we really do have it all. 1,000 years of history and big names like William the Conqueror, Henry II, King John, a tarmac-crunching hunt for the first royal buildings here at Windsor, and there's more.
Also at Windsor, we were hunting for a huge medieval structure built for Edward III's Knights of the Round Table. This quest took us to the private upper end of the castle.
We're going to be putting some very big holes into the Queen's ceremonial lawn.
At Holyrood House, the Queen's Palace in Scotland, Neil Oliver and Francis Pryor were in charge.
This place is a who's who of British history. Queen Victoria lived here. Bonnie Prince Charlie slept here. What else?
Oliver Cromwell trashed the place. King Charles I was crowned here, and Mary, Queen of Scots, witnessed a grisly murder here.
But we're looking for the earliest royal residence here at Holyrood, a palace built by James IV in 1501. But before that, we go right back in time to the first building on the site to answer a question: how, when and why a monastery was turned into a palace.
My base for the weekend was Buckingham Palace. Here we were looking for no less than 3 grand townhouses that stood on this site one after another before the palace. There'd be trenches all over the garden, and we were going to scour every document we could lay our hands on. To get this far, we'd had the full support of the royal household, we'd cleared everything with English heritage and historic Scotland, but we still had to get the word from the very top.
Here they are.
When do you take your hat off?
No.
Mr. Tony Robinson, ma'am, and Mr. Philip Harding.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for letting us dig your garden. Promise not to try and get you up too early.
I shall be well away.
In Windsor, we may have the very, very first palace that's just under the ground.
That's near the chapel.
That's right. I believe, too, that at Holyrood you've got a mound which you're particularly interested
Yes, there's a mound.
We've got no idea what it is.
So they're going to dig up everything.
There's plenty of interesting things coming up from the
This was a pond, most of the history. All the water drained out into the Thames.
It's going to be a fantastic weekend.
No, absolutely.
The Queen, she's very much up for that mound, yes.
Rubbish.
Well, yes, why not? It'd be great if we were able to tell you stuff about your own home that you didn't know.
I think they're genuinely interested in that,
so.
too.
I think so.
Absolutely.
We can take our suits off now. This is the mound at Holyrood that the royal family were talking about. The Queen herself had played here when she was a child, but she had no idea why it was there. So as the mound had no direct bearing on the palace, we decided to tackle it the day before our main dig, when we were on air for a half-hour preview. Phil was volunteered to Scotland, I royal command.
For me, if I was in the south of England, it's got to be a Bronze Age burial mound.
How does that explanation sit with you, Gordon?
Unlikely, but I suspect it's more to do with the gardens.
I've heard tell that Queen Victoria's children used to roll their Easter eggs down it.
I couldn't possibly comment.
Go to it, Phil.
I
think
want
that's
to get
shovel.
on with this.
The mound looked like it covered an old tree stump, until Phil's eagle eye locked onto our first find.
What the hell's that? Well, that's a pencil, isn't it?
The one they used to scratch on a slate.
Yeah, that's right. What we ought to do now is work out which member of the royal family used that.
We then started uncovering all sorts of rubbish.
No.
Look at all these oyster shells.
I
They
know.
certainly like their oysters.
I know they did.
But just beneath the rubbish, Phil couldn't believe his luck.
Oh, that's a crown. There's a crown on that side.
It looks like a Scottish
Hey?
crown.
Come here and have a look.
Clean it a bit.
It looked like a royal seal. The further down we went, the more the mound resembled a historical layer cake.
You're still getting the Victorian stuff.
No, that's the beautiful thing about it. All the pottery that we're getting now is 17th century.
At Windsor, we were gearing ourselves up for two huge excavations. We'd stripped off the tarmac at the lower end outside St George's Chapel, and at the upper end, we'd marked out the first trench. Once the public had gone home, we could have the run of the place. And with an early burst of energy, the Windsor team demonstrated both the complexity and the scale of this great castle.
So, Julian, what are you hoping to find underneath this lawn?
Well, it's an amazing opportunity to discover a really extraordinary building, King Edward III's Round Table. It's very big, royal building for the king and his knights, and we don't actually know what it was used for.
So it's a bit of a mystery.
It's a complete mystery.
Right. Look, I'm off to the lower ward. See you.
I'm glad she's broken into a trot. In fact, a bit of a sprint there, because it's actually half a kilometre, isn't it, the whole span of the
It's an
castle?
enormous site.
And there, can we see the round tower?
That's the famous round tower of Windsor.
Here on the map, yes.
Right in the middle, and it's stood on top of, that grassy bit, is the motte of the early Norman castle.
Take a look, she's not an idiot, she's got a bicycle to help her. So that wall there is the wall around the grassy bit of the motte, is it?
Yeah, she's cycling around the base of the motte here, gives a great idea of what an enormous, imposing feature it was. The bottom bit is what we call the lower ward. It's, if you like, the more public face of the castle.
So this is the bit where the tourists pay to see, and whereas the other bit is a sort of private queen's
That's
element.
quite right, quite right.
And what's that there?
Oh, that's Edward III's tower. Edward III was responsible for a massive refurbishment of the castle. That tower is named after him. It had his clock in.
And look at that amazing view of St George's Chapel, which I'm assuming is this big middle bit.
It's the building here. Yes, she's just going round the end of it here.
And she's in the front of the steps, and
Yes.
I'm told that the services aren't going to stop, not even for Time Team. And where's she coming now? Where do we see
She's
her now?
just coming about this spot here.
Hi. This is Tim Tattenbrown. He's looking after the excavations down here in the lower ward. Tim, what are you going to find under the concrete?
We're hoping to find the Great Hall of Henry III's very large residence in the Lower Ward here.
Fantastic.
Not bad, eh? 1,000 years in just 3 minutes.
Back in London, Geophys and the coring team had been collecting their data. We'd no idea what was under these pristine lawns, and we needed to know where we should begin digging some huge holes. But, of course, the history of the present palace is well known. Most of what we see today was the brainchild of George IV, one of the Queen's most colourful and extravagant ancestors. During my own personal guided tour, I began to get to grips with this iconic building. This is the story of how an ostentatious private home, Buckingham House, was transformed into a great royal residence, Buckingham Palace. The Duke of Buckingham's townhouse had been royal property for almost 60 years. George III had bought it from the Duke as a family home, installed the wife and kids, and then pretty much forgot about it. But his son George IV, a flamboyant spendthrift, had much grander designs for the building. George's great project was to transform Buckingham House into a truly magnificent palace. He doubled the size of the main block, massively increased the size of the wings, and redecorated the interior with the latest French furniture and ornaments. And this grand staircase is one of the two main parts of George IV's Buckingham Palace which still survive. What do you think George IV was looking for in a palace?
Well, I think he and his favourite architect, John Nash, looked at London and they saw this medieval, sort of bustling, winding town with scarcely any grand architecture. And the old Palace of St James is practically falling down. George IV, the great European, he knew exactly what Napoleon had done in France, and he saw the grandeur of the Tuileries Palace and so on.
So he was after a palace that looked like theirs?
Absolutely.
The staircase is pretty grand, isn't it?
Well, it reminds me more of a sort of a theatre or an opera staircase. Because
up to the circle?
Yes, and it has this effect on you as you go up it. It propels you up. When you get to the top, you're in an excited frame of mind.
Thanks to George, a party at Buckingham Palace became like a night at the opera. And just as impressive was the other part of his palace which still survives, George's throne room. Oh, yes, this is just like the proscenium arch in front of a theatre stage, isn't it?
It is, and in fact there is a stage. It's the dais or platform for the throne here in the throne room.
That must have been stunning just walking into this.
Yes, George IV was really the most theatrical monarch we've ever had. He loved all the dressing up and the business of playing the part of king.
Did he revel in sitting on the throne in this room?
Well, we don't know that because the palace wasn't completed by the time he died in the summer of 1830, so he never sat under this throne canopy.
Although George was never able to enjoy his magnificent palace, the taxpayer enjoyed a bill of £750,000. In today's money, that's 1.7 billion, or twice the cost of the Millennium Dome. As soon as George's niece, Queen Victoria, came to the throne, she and her husband began transforming the place from a royal playground into a royal home. The most visible change was the construction of a brand new wing across the front. It's this facade that you can see today from the Mall, the public face of Buckingham Palace. But the idea behind it was altogether private.
She needed more room for her growing little family. And, of course, that's what you've got. You've got nurseries at the top and domestic offices down below.
But between the cots and the teddy bears were rooms which, to a child's eye, must have seemed magical. What's so impressive about this is it's just wave after wave of really elegant rooms. What did Victoria do in this one?
Well, it's one of the sequence of interconnecting staterooms, and she would have used it for those great entertainments that she held in the first 20 years of her reign, musical evenings, dances with thousands of guests using these rooms.
It must have been quite a flurry each time she entered one of these rooms.
Well, she had a particular way of getting into the staterooms without actually using the main entrance.
Which was? How extraordinary. Oh, let's see what's in here. Not going to tell you. Surprisingly, there was one casualty of Victoria's expansion. George IV spent almost 1/10 of his entire palace refurbishment budget on one structure, which would be an icon, a major landmark in the centre of London. It's this. Except it's not here anymore, is it? They've moved it. It's about a mile away in that direction. It was made of the finest Italian marble. It was the grand entranceway to Buckingham Palace at the top of the Mall. It was, of course, the Marble Arch, an entranceway fit for a king. Well, it was fit for George IV, but not quite so fit for his niece, Queen Victoria, because when they were rehearsing her coronation, they discovered that her carriage wouldn't fit through the middle of it. So if they were going to do the procession, they'd have to come along like that and then do a big turn round and come back round here. Not very regal, was it? So the whole thing became an object of derision. It seemed to epitomise the absurd extravagance of George IV. And eventually, in 1851, it was removed from outside Buckingham Palace and replaced here at the top of the Edgware Road, just down from the kebab shops. Sad, really. Our half-hour preview was almost over, which meant catching up with Phil. He'd spent the day digging through that strange mound up in Holyrood, and with the finds pouring out, he was one happy digger.
Oh, it has just been such a good day, far exceeded my expectations. I mean, we've had so much material out of it. We've had oyster shell, we've had animal bone, we've had pottery, but the real gem has been this 16th or 17th century seal matrix. I mean, it is just such an exquisite thing. And the archaeology itself far exceeded my expectations.
There were clear signs of a wall at the bottom of the mound. After the stone had been removed, layers of royal rubbish had been chucked in the hole. The Victorians added another foot or so of rubbish, and then someone turfed it over. Who knows, maybe Queen Victoria did roll her Easter eggs down it after all. This seal matrix, used to mark the sealing wax on letters, could easily have been used by someone close to Mary, Queen of Scots. It was just a hint of a thrilling weekend to come. It was the first full day of our huge Royal Archaeology Fest, and work got underway on all three palaces. Our operational hub was Buckingham Palace, which, despite being the headquarters of the monarchy, has been a royal palace for less than 200 years. So my first job, with a bit of TV trickery, was to turn the clock back a couple of centuries. John Nash had designed the palace for George IV, and major bits were added later by Queen Victoria. But we had to get rid of it all in our quest for the past. Our task over the next 3 days is to strip all this modern stuff away and get back to the roots of the building as it would have been before it was a palace. We're now in the quadrangle, but it hasn't been a quadrangle for long. Why not? Because Queen Victoria had this range built 150 years ago. So let's get rid of that, and let's put back the Marble Arch, which would have been around about there. Now let's get rid of John Nash's work for George IV. These wings have got to go, but there was something there before, so let's have a guess. This is the main range that I'm walking through now. It looks pretty Victorian, and indeed Queen Victoria did a lot of redecoration, moved the furniture about, changed the use of the rooms, as you do. But basically this is as John Nash designed it for George IV. OK, so that's the front done and the middle, but now let's see what we think this back range would have looked like round about 1800, before it became a palace. I say think it would have looked like because nobody's quite sure where Buckingham House, as it was called in those days, began and where it ended. And that's our first job, to sort out the house and the gardens. Although apparently the gardens were much more elaborate in those days than they are now. We'll see. Back from Scotland, Phil was getting ready to carve up his second royal lawn.
Great place to put a trench, isn't it? Front door of Buckingham Palace.
We can see just how elaborate the Duke of Buckingham's gardens were on this old map. In the centre is a huge ornamental canal. This was Phil's first target, and if anything was going to be able to find 400 square metres of early Hanoverian water feature, it had to be this high-tech baby. But possibly not.
I mean, we've not got it in the magnetics. We've not got it in the resistance.
No.
Have you got it in the radar?
Can't see it there. There's nothing that looks like that canal.
I think we'll use the excuse it was above ground.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, aqueduct, perhaps.
Yes.
So finding the canal wasn't going to be as easy as we'd thought. And we couldn't just focus on Buckingham House. We knew there were 2 buildings on this site before the Duke of Buckingham lived here, and both of them had extensive gardens. So how are you going to unpick everything?
Well, we've got some drawings which are really helpful. Here's Buckingham House, a nice block with wings. There's Arlington, like a capital H shape. And then we've got Goring here. It gets sketchier, doesn't it, the further back you go? But there's a block with a flat-leaded roof. Now, these are all reassuringly typical of their age. And changing fashions, changing materials, and different builders' methods are the clues which might help me work out what's left of each of them.
Meanwhile, Stu...
The maps, we've also got a wealth of information on this collection of maps, showing us not only the changes in the houses, but also the garden fashion that goes with the houses. Unfortunately, the gardens do seem to have survived through time, so we can work back and find out where these gardens were and therefore where the houses might be. For instance, we've got this lovely plan here of Buckingham's gardens in the early 1740s, showing Buckingham's house here, elaborate gardens, and a nice canal coming out symmetrically in front of it. We've got massive information to work from.
If we're going to find out anything about these houses, we simply have to find the major garden features from Buckingham House, which was here before the palace. But what's really fascinating is that the Duke of Buckingham, the owner of Buckingham House, turns out to have been a rather troublesome subject, arguably even a treasonous one. Buckingham Palace looked very different in the 18th century, because back then it was a grand private townhouse named Buckingham House, after its extraordinary owner, the Duke of Buckingham. The Duke was a bit of a rake. Indeed, so much so that his promising political career was scuppered by all his womanising, the final outrage being when he made what was known at the time as a brisk attempt on the King's daughter, Princess Anne. As you can imagine, royal retribution followed pretty swiftly. He was stripped of his posts, he was banned from the palace, and eventually he was posted to Tangier. But Buckingham was a survivor, and he was soon back in town with a new wife whose ambition outstripped even his. The Duchess of Buckingham was the daughter of King James II, meaning royal Stuart blood ran through her veins. Except he got her nowhere because she was illegitimate, the daughter of the King's mistress rather than his wife.
She herself was so stuffed up with pride that she always treated her household as if they were a court. It was very stiff, very starchy, very oppressive.
The Duchess considered her Stuart blood far more royal than that of the new arrival from Hanover, the reigning King George I. Did she conspire against George?
In a word, I think she probably did. She visited the old pretender, James III, her half-brother, in Rome. She actually went into his palace, which was a treasonable offence in itself.
Why didn't they arrest her?
It would seem that Walpole, the Prime Minister of the day, who had a very extensive spy network, preferred to have her not arrested in order to lead him to other treasonable people.
So at the beginning of the 18th century, treachery stalked the Mall, and its home was right here in the original Buckingham House, an extremely grand town house surrounded by elegantly manicured gardens, which was destined to become, by a wonderful irony, the very seat of the monarchy that the Buckinghams had wanted so passionately to overthrow. It's what time? 10 to 12, and him and me are still blundering around the back garden of Buckingham Palace, desperately trying to find some garden features, because GeoFizz haven't found anything at all. There's supposed to be a huge ornamental canal here,
It's
isn't there?
really weird that they can't find a feature as big as that. I really don't understand the reason for that.
Stuart, Tony and Mick here, you can't help us find this canal, can you?
Well, I've been able to work out where the line of the canal should be. We've got plans which give us its exact line, and we do know that the present Buckingham Palace, the symmetry of it, is on the same symmetry as Buckingham's house. So what I've done is I've given the coordinates and measurements to Henry, and he should be in the process of setting that position out now.
Yes, thank you, mate. Henry's here. We've also got Jane over here doing the coring. Have you found any evidence of this ornamental canal?
None at all.
Ah.
What we can give you is a river.
Oh, that's good.
This is the mysterious River Tyburn, presumably.
Yes, I'm sure it's the Tyburn.
That's good.
We've got coarse-grained sediments which come from a large body of water moving. An ornamental canal would only have very gently moving water, would only drop very fine sediment, of which we've got no sign in this hole here.
But have you got the canal anywhere?
We have a possibility. In a core further to the southwest, we've got 2 fine-grained layers of clay, which might actually have been used as packing for a water feature.
2 lots of evidence.
Yeah.
Where do we put the trench?
Well, I think we could put our trench across the canal, sort of anywhere in its length. But if Jane's got evidence of the river as well, we should position it to try and hit both of those. After all, we've only got one chance on this lawn. We've only got one place to look, so we might as well hit 2 targets with that one trench.
It's a gamble. We'd spent all morning working out where to put our first trench, and it was a tough call. By bringing together all the available evidence, Stuart's maps and the various coring deposits, Mick decided to dig here. It was a small trench in a huge space, made more uncertain by the total lack of GeoFizz.
You know, if we're not going to get the canal coming straight through here, well, if we're not going to get it here, we're not going to get it anywhere, are we, don't it?
Compared to Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle's history stretches back into the mists of time. The site's been continually occupied by our kings and queens for nearly 1,000 years and has got seam upon seam of deposits. Experts had long been puzzled as to the whereabouts of 2 really important royal buildings that disappeared centuries ago, if they ever existed. Now we had the chance to mount the first full-scale hunt for them.
OK, so we have a massive great castle with 2 sites, one in the upper ward and one down here in the lower ward. Now, Tim, you're the Commander-in-Chief over this dig. What is it you're actually looking for?
Well, what we're looking for is what was here before this great chapel was built, because before the middle of the 14th century, this was another great royal residence, particularly for Henry III, and at the very centre of his residence was a huge great hall, somewhere here, which is completely disappeared today.
You talk of a huge great hall and then you say it's somewhere here. Why don't we know specifically where these kings feasted?
Well, because in the later Middle Ages, it was surplus to requirements and completely demolished.
OK, so that's you on a hunt in the lower ward. Meanwhile, in the upper ward, Julian, what are you after?
A truly enigmatic building, one of the most mysterious buildings in medieval England. And this is where the kings played. It was a big round building. That round, or that round. 200 foot in diameter. We know it was built in the 1340s, and we don't really know what it was, and we don't really know where it was.
So, very big, very enigmatic.
Yes.
These huge questions about Edward III's mysterious round table made it a fabulous target for us. For archaeologists, this was the last big unknown at Windsor Castle, the one they never thought they'd have the opportunity to investigate. To get permission to dig in the lawn at all, we had to send GeoFizz in a few weeks earlier. Thankfully, this large curved feature persuaded everyone that we had to dig. Julian decided to put his first trench in here. But why might King Edward III have wanted a strange building like this?
On one occasion, in 1344, they had this great Arthurian tournament. So obviously the king was Arthur and his knights. And at the great feast at the end of this, he announced the establishment of a knightly order, a chivalric order of the Knights of the Round Table.
And
When you talk of the Round Table, what are we supposed to be imagining?
Well, a round table could be a table you sat at, but it also was a building. Because we've actually got building accounts for the building of the Round Table at Windsor. Never quite tells us where it is. But the building accounts talk of stonework, of foundations, then a bit of timber work, a bit of a tiled roof, as they built a round table. The contemporary chronicler said it was circular and it was about 200 foot in diameter. So it was very big and very round. A building which at that date it would have been impossible to put a roof on.
Like an arena, almost.
Like an arena. So whereas now grand state banquets are held in this hall that we're in,
Yeah.
if you can imagine that turned into a circle, you could have had something, a building that functioned both as an arena and also as a great round table for the king to dine at with his knights.
Down in the lower ward, Tim was looking for our second lost building, the earliest royal palace on the site. He believed there was a great hall with a royal chamber, the king's living quarters, built onto it. To find it, we'd got to trash the car park. Well, someone had to do it. How are you doing?
Well, it's looking good so far. We've got this brick rubble coming down, a bit of clay, and we've got quite a good spread of lime mortar.
Tim planned 3 trenches here. One on the junction between the royal chamber and the Great Hall, one on the corner of the royal chamber, and a third to find the outside wall of the Great Hall itself. But there was layer upon layer of history to get through first, starting with Denton's Commons, an old choir boys' hostel knocked down over a century ago.
This must be the 1859 demolition rubble here, and then underneath here is our real archaeology.
It only took a couple of hours to get down to the Tudor layers.
We've actually got the inside of the spiral staircase curving round there. All this brickwork.
Absolutely brilliant. And you've got the plaster face on it here, so you should get the steps in the spiral should be underneath. But this, of course, is for Denton's Commons of 1519.
Yeah.
So we want the medieval, so what else have you got?
Well, over this side, we've got quite a good spread of Reigate chippings.
So you have, so this could be the floor level in the Great Hall.
The Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh lies at the southern end of the Royal Mile. At the northern end is the castle, which was the original seat of the Scottish kings. But in the 13th century, the royals exchanged this draughty perch for Holyrood, which was then an Augustinian monastery. It was just a mile away, but in a more sheltered spot. Neil Oliver was there.
The reason we've come to Holyrood is to find the first royal palace, the one built by James IV in the early 16th century. But the story is much more complicated than that, because the first building on the site is much older. It was established by King David I of Scotland in the 12th century. It was an abbey, and all that remains is the ruins of the abbey church. Francis, this is a fantastic place.
I love it. It really is incredible. I mean, it started off as a religious place, and then it became a royal place, and for 300 years, the religious and the royal coexisted happily.
So you're saying that the kings and queens liked the place so much, they decided to become royal squatters in the home of the monks?
Yes, but because they were royal and they had power, they altered the home of the monks to their own ends.
Because, of course, the building of the palace that we see today is relatively modern.
Well, yes, it is, on the outside, but in the centre, the guts, if you like, they're really ancient.
So ancient, they go back to the time of King David I, who came to the Scottish throne in 1120. He lived in Edinburgh Castle, but there's an intriguing legend about why he founded the monastery. King David loved to hunt, but one Sunday in 1128, he was attacked by a white stag that unseated him from his horse and prepared to gore him. As David lay there on his back, terrified and preparing to meet his maker, he had a vision. The stag's antlers had mysteriously transformed into a cross that he was able to reach out and grasp. The stag ran away, and the King of Scotland was left holding a holy cross that had saved his life. To honour the miracle, the pious and awestruck David founded an Augustinian abbey on the site of his stag epiphany. It would be known forever after as Holyrood.
Holy means holy,
and Rud means cross. So it's the Holy Cross. So David I must have given the name Holyrood, the Holy Cross, to this abbey.
But what started as a purely religious institution was destined to become the home of David's descendants and Scotland's most important royal palace. We were sure the links between the monastery and the royal palace would be buried amongst the tantalising walls under the Holyrood lawns. With some incredibly clear geophysics results, the question was where we should begin digging.
I know that geophysics is absolutely blinding, but I'm going to go for an area where there's almost nothing, and I'm going to go for the cloister.
Why cloisters? What will they tell us?
Well, the cloister was converted into the Great Hall, and so if we can find the cloister, we can find the Great Hall of the Palace of James IV.
So that is the transition from one to the other?
Exactly.
Francis put in 3 trenches to search for the missing monastic cloister and the buildings associated with the Great Hall. If we are in the right place, what's the first thing we're going to see?
Tops of walls? So if we're very lucky, tops of walls, possibly some bits of Victorian gardening first.
The main thing is that this is about as good preservation as you will find anywhere.
Yeah.
It does certainly look like the turf coming off of a bowling green, I have to say.
Yeah, hit a stone already. Yeah.
So there were walls under Neil's bowling green, but were they monastery, palace, or both? At the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh, we'd already put in 3 trenches to uncover the monastery cloister, because it was here, we thought, King James IV built the Great Hall, the heart of the first royal palace. But that wasn't the only missing piece in the jigsaw. Around the corner from the cloister, we put in 2 more trenches to unravel the mystery of a missing residential wing. It was also built by James IV, and, typically for us, it disappeared centuries ago. But it was captured on an amazing 3D map. This mapping technique was state-of-the-art for the 17th century, and relied entirely on the mapmaker working from a high vantage point.
Okay, this seems just about right, doesn't it, looking at it? We're in the right place.
Yes, he's a wee bit higher than we are, but I think it's accurate, and although there are various other perspectives he must have taken, this is close to where he must have been to take the view.
However, looking at the palace itself and our view from here, I think we're pretty clear that it's an accurate representation.
It is accurate, and it'll be a great help when we try to decipher the features under the ground.
The detail in the map's exquisite, and it clearly showed the wing that's missing today. Among the documents, we also found an 18th century floor plan. If we could match any walls in the ground to this diagram, then we could work out where the rest of the wing was. After a valiant day's digging, on the back lawn of the palace, buried under a strange load of garden rubbish.
So, Francis, have you found us a cloister?
We've got a huge wall here, you can see, with these great stones underneath it. But what's very odd, the upper stones have been removed, they've been robbed out. What we have is a spread of sort of rubbly stuff mixed with oyster shells and covering these wall stones, and about that thick. And then when we look in the next trench, we seem to have a wall also under this stone.
If that is the wall of an east-west range, and this mortar here represents a wall of a north-south range, look where it's aiming, Neil, right up to the church. This could be the wall of the east range of the cloister.
This could be the continuation of that stump
Exactly.
over there. How fantastic. Gordon, do you think we're on track for the cloisters, the refectory?
I think we are now. I think it's also a bit of a triumph for geophysical survey. That stuff's well buried. To pick them up at all was something of a triumph.
So they'd had a good first day at Holyrood. And at Buckingham Palace, Phil too had been beavering away in his trench in the Queen's back lawn, searching for the Duke of Buckingham's ornamental canal. No canal yet, but a beer mug was enough to keep him happy.
That's a nice handle attachment in there.
Right.
Oh, look at that!
Oh, there's a lot more of it.
That's the rest of the base.
That's the other half, by the
That
way,
is.
isn't it?
That's the other part.
The construction evidence was beginning to appear, which was just the business for our buildings expert, Jonathan Foyle.
Oh, there we are, Jonathan. Nearly complete brick.
Ah, that's
getting
nice.
a lot of them like that.
It's handmade, it's a mixture of rough clays, beautiful texture to it. And this sort of period, maybe 1670 through to 1710, 20. I tell you what I don't know yet is whether this is the rubble from old Arlington House. I doubt it because there's no mortar on it. Or whether, what seems more likely, they're made for John Sheffield, who becomes Duke of Buckingham, and they're made afresh for his canal.
Well, we ain't going to sort that out by stop talking about it. Let's go on and find out. We're digging about it.
Leave us posted.
Have a cab! Advance your pipe!
Just 50 years or so before Buckingham built the canal that Phil was looking for, England was embroiled in the Civil War. King Charles's royalists were sulking out in Oxford, and London was the stronghold of Oliver Cromwell's Roundhead army. A well-known royalist, Lord Goring, was living here then, but Cromwell kicked him out and confiscated the whole property. An old map shows part of the huge ring of Cromwell's defences running through these gardens.
Does show the defences going all the way around the western part of London here. So we must be in roughly the right area because that road junction here, it must be the Wellington Arch over there, mustn't it? It's where those three roads join.
So our next target was to see if we could find any sign of the barricades. With some expert guidance from Geophys, we sunk another trench into these manicured lawns. The trench produced some juicy finds very quickly.
What do you make of that?
I don't know. I think this one, due to the pattern, dates between 1840 and 1880, and that's when manufacturers started to put slogans and advertising logos on clay pipes.
This Victorian pipe meant we were still over 200 years away from the Civil War, so the only way was down. We'd taken a huge gamble with the position of Phil's trench. It was impossible to tell if the bricks we'd found were from a Hanoverian water feature or the demolition rubble from an earlier townhouse. So could Phil be really sure he'd got the canal?
It took me a long time to resolve it, but the clue is in this clay at the bottom here.
Yeah.
And that clay is really, really clean, and it sits on top of this gravel. And I think that clean clay is the lining of the canal.
Yeah.
And you see above it, we've got more clay, but that's very dirty clay, and it's got these bits of brick in it. And I think that's what they've done there, is they've actually pushed in the sides of the canal when they've demolished it, and they've only actually filled it up to about there, and then maybe it after a period of time, the monarch doesn't like the idea of having a bit of a concavity in the middle of the lawn, so they fill up the rest with rubbish.
So are we saying that Stuart's right, that the line of the canal is along here, and all the demolition has just been chucked in all the way along?
Yeah, I think he is. I think it ran right across here, and as Phil says, it's all been filled in with the most amazing debris.
The next task was to establish how wide the canal was. In Windsor Castle's lower ward, they'd spent the day digging through loads of historic levels looking for Henry III's Great Hall. In this labyrinth of buildings, the car park was the only open area to begin digging. And what's more, there were some giveaway clues in the houses nearby.
OK, so what do we have here?
Well, we've got a wonderful 13th century scissor brace roof, and this is the oldest one surviving in the castle and one of the oldest in England.
What does the scissor brace actually mean?
Well, as you can see, these are the rafters and the braces are in a scissor form.
When you say it's one of the oldest roofs in England, how do you know that?
Well, we can tell from particularly the way the roof is put together, and if you look here, you will see there is a joint, and this is called a notch lap joint. This is the notch. Later they have tenon and mortise joints, but when you have a notch slap joint, you know straight away you're dealing with something quite early.
And downstairs in the same house, there are more clues to Windsor's original Great Hall.
This is another remarkable fragment that was only found in the 1960s of an early 13th century doorway. You can see the elaborate 13th century mouldings and then a carved capital here, and what is missing is the Purbeck marble shaft coming down here. This was almost certainly one of the main doors from the lodgings of Henry III into the Great Hall, just through there.
And by the looks of it, this isn't the only doorway, because you've got one here, the more ornate one, and then this round cruder version.
That's right, and this is a very important discovery because it's possible that this round arch could be part of Henry II's buildings on this site, because it was Henry II, a generation before, in the 1170s, who almost certainly first built a great hall here and had a lodging in the lower ward of the castle.
It was so tantalising seeing those bits of the Great Hall. Outside in the car park, later buildings were still getting in our way, but they were becoming a lot easier to understand. Matt, I recognise that hole. It's the Tudor stairway, isn't it?
Yep, standing right in it here.
Can I come and have a look?
Yeah, if you just carefully jump over there.
OK. But I'm afraid, exciting though something Tudor sounds, we're looking for a great medieval hall, something earlier.
Yep, and we've got evidence for it across this trench, but the best evidence is here. Ignore the bricks.
OK.
Can you see that enormous chalk block there?
The big one?
Big one there. There's another one there.
Yeah.
And there's all this rubble here. That's limestone and Reigate stone as well.
And this, you reckon, is 13th century?
This is classic 13th century high-status building material.
Tim, does this tally with what you expected?
Well, that, I think, is part of the chamber block, but there is the wall, which should be the Great Hall, which is coming this way up here.
So, in other words, this would have been the place where they slept, but we still need to find the party
house. And the Great Hall should be up the hill.
OK, well, we're going to have a look in the other trench.
Look around that way there, please.
OK, so this is the trench where we want more walls.
Yeah, and as you can see, we've got more of the possible floor surface, this yellow stuff here, but there is no wall yet.
No, it's a bit disappointing, just some modern red brick.
Well, this is 18th century, but we were looking for a chalk wall, and they can't find them here.
So, Tim, that's not so good, is it? If we look at the map, there's the chapel, there's your chamber that you were talking about, but here's the wall. This is where we want a sopping great
That's right.
wall.
Well, we haven't found it yet, I'm afraid, but we're still hoping down here.
Well, where is it?
We'll find it for you.
If Tim wasn't happy in the lower ward, our search up the hill for the other lost medieval building, the Round Table, wasn't looking much better. Our first trench contained nothing but centuries of rubble. Not surprising, given that this quadrangle has had several royal makeovers, including the Victorian Gothic that we see today. All we had of the Round Table was this geophysics plot showing a possible curved wall. Could that tell us if the building would even have fitted into the castle walls?
How big is that?
That's 222 feet.
220? That's a bit on the large side.
Yeah.
Could you run that with the historic plan of the castle before the Victorians got their hands on it?
That.
Right, this is
here.
the plan before the rebuilding in the 19th century. So that is actually crossing the medieval, the curtain wall of Henry II.
Yeah.
I'm not sure we can go with 220 feet. What about 200 feet, which is what the chronicler actually says?
So this is the circle if it was 200 feet.
Ah.
With the confidence of the computer plan behind him, and just as our first day's work was winding down, Julian was beginning to see the shadows of a huge building.
What we've got cutting across the trench in just the right position is a slot. You can see the base of it there cut into the chalk, filled with rubble, the hard black edge. Look at on the left here, we've got a curving off there where Guy's just pointing, and on the right where Rich has got marking the section where it's cut, it comes right across here.
And what does this mean, these edges?
This is the edge of a large robber trench.
And what's a robber trench?
A robber trench is where there was something like a big wall that's been robbed out for its decent masonry and all the rubbish thrown back in.
So this is like a ghost wall?
It's the ghost wall of a very large building curving round here.
Let's go to some real finds. The finds expert, Faye, what have you got?
What we've got is 2 pieces of pottery, Surrey whiteware, probably Kingston, and some shell sandy tempered ware.
Can you date it, though? That's the key. Can you date it?
Yes, we can. This shirt here is 14th century.
Hold it there. Okay. 14th century. Does that tally with your round table building?
Exactly, 1344.
So we could be onto something. Tony, do you hear that? We could be onto something. If all these guys are right, we have got the edge of the round table building, the elusive round table building. Tomorrow, that means we can go inside the building and who knows, find out what went on in there. Feasting or fighting?
It was hard to quite share Tessa's enthusiasm. We had our own problems at Buckingham Palace. It's pouring down with rain. It's pitch dark, but we're still here. And you're clutching this little find here.
Yeah, well, we've got quite a lot of finds when they backfilled the whole thing, which is sometime in the 18th century. And we think this is a beer mug, don't we?
And I want one that's full up right now.
That wouldn't be big enough for you.
Put that down carefully. We're going off on a little trip. Because, come on!
I'm going to the pub.
This isn't the only trench that we've put in today, is it? I would have thought that apart from the darkness, this would have been a pretty easy kind of place to dig.
Yeah, but the problem is, stuff's been recycled, holes have been filled in, hills have been removed. There's an awful lot of landscaping at a place like this.
Mick and I had to find the rest of the team at our Civil War trench on the far side of the garden. Just one snag. I could hardly see where I was going.
Bridget, this is the trench, isn't it?
It is. This is where the Civil War defences were supposed to be.
And how have we got on here?
Well, unfortunately, we've been a bit scuppered by Nash. In 1825, he came along here and he redesigned the gardens and the landscape, a bit like the pond that's over there today.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, what he did at that time was he also removed the Civil War defences if they were here at all.
So we've got absolutely nothing?
No, we've got little sneak previews as to what we have, what was here. I mean, we've got very early pot, we've got rivet, we've got, that could be from the Civil War, we've also got a squashed musket ball, so somebody was here shooting guns.
What do you mean you've got very early pot?
Well, there's a wonderful bit of medieval pot down here.
Where's that?
Here we go. It's a piece of South Herts greyware.
So when we say medieval, what sort of period are we talking?
Yeah, this is 12th, 13th century. And
now that is interesting.
Yeah, and it's not bashed around, so it suggests we're not far from a settlement.
Yeah. That's really exciting because we've got all these maps that tell us about the houses and everything else in the 17th century, but it's a real blank here before that period, so that's actually a very important piece of evidence,
Absolutely,
isn't it?
that's a fantastic find.
Let's go back to the Civil War for one moment. If there had been defences here, and we think there were, don't we?
Yep.
What would they have been like? What would have been going on?
Earthworks. You're facing cannon. You can't have a high medieval-style castle wall, otherwise they'll be smashed to smithereens. So what you have is low-sloping earthen banks, backed with stone, and jutting out so you can fire along the walls.
We'd hoped to find some trace of these earthworks by the end of our first day's digging, but it looked like George IV's gardeners had landscaped them clean away. But the next day would bring a breakthrough for Phil.
We have got here the end of the canal.
It's the second full day of Time Team's Royal Weekend, with our unprecedented licence to dig the 3 royal palaces. At each of our locations, we were hunting for lost buildings, hoping to fill in major gaps in the history of these magnificent houses. At Buckingham Palace, we were getting close to pinpointing the Duke of Buckingham's house, which had been knocked down to make way for the palace we see today. Phil had finally worked out how the ornamental canal was built.
You know that clay that we had yesterday? And we said it was probably the puddling, the lining for the canal.
I was convinced about that.
Yeah, but you're gullible. You're easily convinced. I wasn't so convinced. I needed to see it. And look, it is actually ended. Yeah. And if you draw a line through that little step of gravel, straight up through there, see that line of red geophysics pegs? Yeah. It goes bang on the left side of the bow room.
Now, we know how wide it is, don't we?
How wide's that?
It's 17 yards.
Then we ought to be able to find the other side.
OK. That's got to be 51 feet, isn't it? They are.
Where does it bring us?
Well, it brings us to the other side of the bow room. Right? So that must be it. So the other side must be somewhere here.
And I reckon we've got to strip this lot out to get a complete section through the canal.
So Phil began extending his trench on either side to confirm his theory. Yesterday, Geophys hadn't been able to see the canal. By the second day, they'd cracked it and were hunting for the steps leading down to it. So with Buckingham House in our grasp, we could turn to the two big houses that were here earlier. Stuart had put in a lot of work to find their garden boundaries.
See, what we're after is this garden, the limit of the gardens that went with Buckingham's house. What's happened is that the old wall has been used as a parish boundary. There's Buckingham's house, that's the present Buckingham Palace in green. Look at this boundary, the parish boundary that's been set out with boundary stones. Look at the shape of it.
And in true Ainsworth style, he probably headed to the most inaccessible part of the palace gardens.
So, here we are. There it is. Right. St George's, Hanover Square, and round here we've got St Martin's in the Field. So if we transfer these points to the modern map, which we can do,
it looked so simple. As soon as Henry's coordinates had been coordinated, Buckingham's 18th century garden wall came looming back to life. But as Geophys hadn't any meaningful results here, the only way to find the earlier houses was to dig.
But one of our first finds in the hunt for the 18th century wall completely threw us.
Is this where you got some flints?
Time to call in our resident flint expert and his young apprentice.
Well, from what you've taught me, that's a big blade bashed off that's been trimmed around the edge. So what, a scraper or something?
I'll never come to you again for advice, will I? It is not a scraper.
Right.
But it is a humanly worked flint.
Right. So what is it?
If you've got Civil War activity around here, who knows? I mean, it could be somebody making gun flints.
Right.
Back on the main lawn, we were in no doubt there'd been a canal here, cut through the gardens. And when it went out of use, it had been filled with building rubble.
You see, yesterday we had a trench that ran from about there to about here. This morning we extended this way, and what have we got? We have got here the end of the canal. And you can see, here's the edge of it, with the natural gravels there, and then the infill in here is this London clay, which they puddled it in to make it watertight. And today we've gone that way, and we've got the other side 51 feet away.
John, this is the huge canal that Geophys totally failed to find.
You can hardly see it.
Oh,
That's right. That's right.
Look, we may not have the edges, but we have got the end of the canal. You can see it clearly here as a resistance response.
Yeah, I can see it there, yeah.
So that's the end, that's the limit of it.
And it goes in this direction, does it?
Yes. I mean, it's basically over here.
Yeah.
But beyond that, what we've got are these other anomalies.
So we've got massive canal.
Ends here.
Yeah.
And then anomalies that we think are the stair base that led to the canal.
Where's that, Mick?
Well, you've got parch marks on each side.
They're
look.
on this side.
Oh, I can see, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Where the grass is dyed, and it runs all along here, and then at the end it sort of turns.
It turns around this way too, doesn't it?
way.
Yeah.
2 days ago, Geophys couldn't see the canal. Now they'd pinpointed the head of Buckingham's water feature, so clearly shown on this old garden plan. This was valuable information for our buildings team. In the incident room, Jonathan was sure that the footprint of Buckingham House still existed under the present palace.
The block of Buckingham House there, you see that central projection?
Yep.
It's reflected in the cellar. And you've got 1, 2, 3 windows above, well, there's 1, 2, 3 storerooms. So I reckon that this cellar is uncompromisingly related to Buckingham House that sits on it.
Jonathan and I went to nosy around the Queen's wine cellar to see what we could find.
Cool! You can see the wall here, can't you? This is zonkingly big.
It's huge, isn't it? That's the gardens that way, Green Park is over there,
Yeah.
and we're entering Buckingham House now, into the wine cellars.
Come on.
Oh, that was a good party, that one, wasn't it?
Look at this, yeah. I tell you, the character of the palace changes immediately you're in here, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Cool, this corridor's long, isn't it?
Goes on for miles, doesn't it? This is the spine of Buckingham House. So the staterooms are above us. And what I really want to do is compare that brick, you see, that came out of the canal with what's in the walls. I mean, there you can see the whitewash is chipped away.
Yeah.
You can match the colour.
Yeah, very similar.
Can't you?
And it looks about the same length, doesn't it?
It is, yeah. Let's find a whole one. I mean, like there, for example, the right proportions.
Yeah.
And that nice handmade texture, that's there too. So I'm pretty convinced that the canal and this house are all built at the same time for the Duke of Buckingham.
That was this morning. Since then, the boys in the incident room have pulled it all together. It's all right, I left the money for this on the side. We can now reveal the full glory that was Buckingham House. Take it away, Guy.
We certainly can, Tony. What we have here is Razan's magnificent graphic of what Buckingham House looked like at its climax in the early 18th century. Jonathan, what are these two wings on either side?
Either one of those would suit me. But the Duke of Buckingham and the Duchess lived in that central block. These wings, after Andrea Palladio, the Italian architect, are merely for people like stable boys, gardeners and so on.
It's a fabulous layout, isn't it?
Lovely.
Now, with the magic of television, what we can do is take Buckingham Palace with our trench in the garden and we can overlay it with what the Duke of Buckingham's garden would have looked like if it was still there today. Isn't that fabulous?
That's wonderful.
And with the formal gardens on either side, the original ones?
Brilliant graphic, that. Really, I wonder if the Queen thinks she's missed a trick on that.
Oh, I don't know, but I love the way you can look up the canal towards the palace. But let's take away Buckingham Palace now and look at the place as if Buckingham House was still standing.
Isn't that fantastic? It all locks in together and you see the simple, bold magnificence of that house. It's a very stately block, isn't it? And that brick and stone, quite Dutch in a way. William III has just finished his reign. He's a Dutch king.
It's magnificent.
After 2 days, Buckingham's lavish townhouse and the centrepiece of his magnificent gardens are done and dusted. We now need to get on looking for the houses that predated Buckingham. Just down the road, in the lower part of Windsor Castle, the search for King Henry III's Great Hall was getting wider and deeper. Among this jumble of residential buildings, it's easy to forget that this royal castle was once a real fighting machine, one of the most fortified strongholds in England. In the early 13th century, Windsor Castle was under siege by the French. 60 knights loyal to Henry III's father, King John, resisted for over 2 months. When the siege was over, the battered castle was upgraded to include next-generation defences.
Goodness, Tim, where are you taking us?
Well, we're actually going down this great hole under the floor. We're going down into a sally port.
And what exactly is a sally port, Tim?
Well, a sally port is something that was built here in the 1220s where soldiers sally forth from the castle and get out and get behind people who are attacking the castle.
So does that mean this is all the real deal from the 13th century?
Absolutely right. This is chalk block and Reigate stone, and all of this was built nearly 800 years ago.
It's been remarkably unspoiled, hasn't it?
It's because very few people have ever actually come here.
Can we go and have a nosy down there?
Yeah.
I feel like a member of the famous five.
Yes.
Oh, it's lethal.
Watch your step when you go down, because they're very steep and very worn.
What was the intention of this?
Well, this is a great wide passage so that soldiers, obviously two side by side, could go right down here, down to the bottom where we're just going to go, and then turn to go under the castle ditch and get out behind the attackers.
The idea that it was built actually for soldiers gives you a real idea that this is a sort of blood and guts castle, doesn't it?
Well, it is, and this must have cost a huge amount of money to build, you see. It shows the sort of latest technology, which only the great royal castles like Dover and Winchester and so on, and Windsor, got to stop them being attacked in the future.
But that's as far as we can go, because the end of the tunnel has collapsed. It was our old friend Henry III who built these defences, making Windsor almost invincible. And that's not all. Henry III, who was on the English throne for a whopping 56 years, did more than any other monarch to turn Windsor into a true royal palace. For instance, he built this fine curfew tower, and he also vastly improved the original Great Hall. But after all the work we'd done looking for that Great Hall, we realised by mid-afternoon on day 2 that this centrepiece of Henry III's royal palace was not where we'd expected.
And so unfortunately, you haven't found any bits of Great Hall in this trench then yet?
No, unfortunately not.
And have you heard the theory that it's actually behind us there and we're in completely the wrong place?
No, I hadn't heard that.
Well, it's hot off the press at the moment, you see.
We couldn't dig any nearer to the chapel, so to widen the search, Tim had been putting new trenches into the tiniest nooks and crannies. But we had identified some buildings. You'll remember the chamber block we talked about yesterday? This bit here on the plan, this yellow rectangle. Well, this big, chunky, chalky white wall is one of the interior walls of this chamber block. So far, so good. It's now that we start running into trouble. If you come with me over here, I'll show you where things go a bit wrong. Because what we're really looking for, our major quest, is of course the Great Hall. This is the Great Hall here. Problem is, we haven't found the walls of the Great Hall. They should be, according to our man Tim, along here, sweeping through here. But all we've got, Tim, is you and a few electrical pipes.
Unfortunately, we haven't found it yet, but we should find it in due course.
No buts, Tim. Yesterday I gave you a B+, and today I'm thinking I might even have to fail you.
However, we have an alternative, because if you look at the plan here, if we slide it like this, one possibility is that the Great Hall is there, up against the curtain wall, underneath that building over there, and that is the area where it's most likely now to be situated.
But we can't dig under a building.
Well, I'm afraid we can, because I had a chat with Alice a little bit earlier, and
What?
she's already digging
Alice
there.
is already over there.
We are getting very close to the Great Hall here. Matt, why did you choose this spot?
Well, if the latest theory is correct, and the hall is up against the curtain wall, that would shift the whole building down like that, which would put this trench hopefully right over the southern wall, and if not, just inside the hall. So if we carry on down here, we might even get some old floor surfaces.
So you think we're getting quite close? And we've just got some fantastic finds. Faye, tell us about these.
We have. I mean, they're absolutely magnificent. I mean, we've basically got this sherd of pottery, which is a base of a large cooking pot. And it's medieval in date, and it's from a very posh table. It's brilliant. It's Surrey Kingston ware.
The finds certainly suggested this place was used by posh people, maybe from the court. Who knows, even the king. In the upper part of the castle, we'd already glimpsed the ghost of the Round Table building we were searching for. Julian had opened 2 more trenches to understand what was going on inside the walls of the building. At first, Trench 2 looked really promising. But in the end, it offered little more than the range of building and demolition rubble you'd expect on a site like this.
We've been pulling out a lot of stone from the upper layers here, and there's a possibility that some of it's medieval. We're not sure. Some of it may be wired. But what we've clearly got is traces of slots for windows, the square holes into which the iron bars went, the ferraments, as they're called.
Next door, the new Trench 3 revealed a crushed chalk layer underneath the stones of a long-lost royal statue base, not the Round Table we were looking for.
Now, Julian, yesterday you told me you'd found the wall of the Round Table building, but actually you haven't found something we can hold on to, have you? Because looking there, I can see where the wall was, but there's nothing in it.
Well, no, we've got a very good edge on the left there, that cut through down there. We got a straight bottom, and we got a curving edge on the right, and then the middle, all the fill of the rubber trench.
OK, I'm convinced the wall was there. But this morning, you actually tried to go inside the Round Table building, didn't you?
Yeah, come on, look. Come on, it's over here.
This one?
Yep. Now here, right down the left-hand side of this trench, we've got compacted chalk, beaten chalk surface
Hang
there.
on, this speckly bit, the brown and the white.
That's right, that there. And this, we actually believe, is the floor of the Round Table building.
So, 700 years ago, people would have been walking at that level across
Not
this
actually
floor.
on there, on a floor laid on top of it. Come look at this. We have minutes ago uncovered this tile. Emily, show us what you've got.
Well, we've got this floor tile here, and we're thinking it probably is actually in situ.
That is that? I mean, can I lift that up and touch it?
No, it's actually embedded into the mortar, the hard mortar around it. And here you can see.
But real, that is really Edward III's proper
Yes.
fancy tiled floor. Now that is what I call a real find. But you know, it's not just the interior of the building that's been taxing the old archaeological grey matter. There's also a big question about what went on up there, the roof. And Alice has the details.
What we're doing is we're laying out the diameter of the Round Table building, and that's Damien down the other end, so he's right at the other side of the building. And it's really not until you do this, until you measure it out and lay out the diameter, that you get an idea of the sheer enormity of the thing. And Julian, you think this huge scale is a problem, don't you?
Yes. I mean, how on earth did you roof it, let alone in a single span?
So you think it didn't have a roof, but Richard, you think it did, don't you?
Yes, because we've got the building accounts, and they tell us how much stone they brought, what they paid for carrying it, and at the bottom, crucially, there are 35,000 lathe bins, and there are 40,000 tiles. That's a hell of a roof.
That's enough tiles to cover something of this diameter, isn't it? But even so, how on earth are they going to actually provide a wooden frame to support those tiles?
Well, we do know that in the 14th century, carpenters were pretty clever at joining bits of timber together to make them longer, so they weren't limited by the size of the trees. They could use joints like this one I prepared earlier.
But is that going to hold up a roof?
Well, there is one test we could do that might demonstrate its efficacy if the buckets don't collapse.
Well, that's certainly holding up under Damien's weight, so it might support a roof. What do you think, Julian?
Well, they have tested these things properly at full size, and they can hold, 10 or 15 tons before they break. So that's OK, but the problem is, where are the posts that held up the roof timbers?
So, still two big questions here. Did the Round Table have a roof? And what extraordinary events would this building have been witness to? And after the break, the shocking story of Henry VIII's bitter revenge on the people of Edinburgh. Up at Holyrood House, the Queen's Royal Palace in Scotland, the team had been unravelling the early monastic buildings. It was difficult to work out how this site had evolved from abbey into royal palace, a transition which had taken 400 years. The previous day, Francis had discovered the cloister wall, which located us within the monastic plan.
Now, what we've done, we've put down some planks to show where the ancient walls would have gone. But first of all, let's get in this trench. This...
Oh, steady now.
This is the wall that we're familiar with. That's the one that's coming from the cloister, OK? But you'll notice there are no walls coming off it.
OK.
OK? That means that the end of the cloister has to be here, OK?
All right.
So now, let's walk up the cloister. There's the main wall, and then the cloister garden's in there. And where I put those sample buckets...
Yes.
They would have been the arches, OK?
Right.
So, cloister garden, windows... Now, we're going to pass through the south wall of the cloister. Bang, we've gone through the wall.
Ma, you paint a vivid picture.
And we're now under the Great Hall, OK, which is on the first floor.
The cloister originally looked like this. Here's the east wall that was robbed out, and the south wall with King James IV's Great Hall built up against it. Before the royals took over, this would almost certainly have been where the original monks' refectory stood, with the kitchens underneath. Our trenches produced a never-ending supply of animal bone, oyster shells and other kitchen waste. In among the finer debris were particles of charcoal, which could just be cooking, or perhaps something rather more traumatic. Around the corner, we were uncovering clear stone foundations from James IV's lost wing. James IV died in combat with the English in 1513. The crown and the palace were handed on to his son. But after 30 years on the throne, James V had a problem. There was no male heir. Could the arrival of Mary Queen of Scots secure the future of the Stuart dynasty? Neil Oliver picks up the story.
The Palace of Holyrood House, 1542. One of the great Scottish monarchs is on his deathbed, but in spite of all his achievements, James V is in despair. His two sons, his only heirs, have just died, and the future of the Stuart dynasty depends on the baby the Queen is about to have, 30 miles away. The precious baby was born in the Queen's bedchamber, here, in Linlithgow Palace. Of course, the midwife saw that rather than a boy, it was a wee girl that had come howling into the world. When the news was brought to the dying king of the arrival of his daughter Mary, he uttered a gloomy prophecy. The devil go with it. It'll end as it began. It came well, lass. It'll gan well, lass.
A woman in the throne is a huge liability, mainly because of the problem of marriage. Who does a woman ruler marry? A foreigner may take over the kingdom.
But now James V was dead. Scotland desperately needed a monarch, and baby Mary was the only legitimate heir. She was rushed to Stirling Castle, where, historically, Scottish monarchs were crowned. She was only 9 months old. The scene must have been bizarre and also very moving. Then, for the very first time, the Scottish crown jewels were used on a monarch. The sceptre was held near her hand, and to the delight of witnesses gathered there, she reached out and grasped it in her tiny fingers. Scotland had her queen, but for Mary, her childhood was over before it had begun. Not least because Henry VIII was already on the prowl. The infant queen presented an irresistible opportunity for him to annex Scotland, to which end he proposed that Mary should marry his infant son, Edward. But the negotiations soon broke down.
You can't do it by diplomacy, he'll do it by force. He'll come up with an army.
The English army ended up on this very ridge, overlooking Edinburgh in their search for the infant Mary. But Mary wasn't in Edinburgh. She was being spirited across Scotland from castle to palace, from secret chamber to tiny island, all to keep her from Henry's clutches. Henry VIII was so furious that he couldn't find Scotland's child queen, he decided to wreak terror on the people of Edinburgh.
We have Henry's utterly chilling, vicious instructions about destroying the buildings, destroying man, woman and child, leave nothing standing.
And all of this just so that a king could get his hands on a baby girl.
Oh yes, that's exactly what it's about.
Henry VIII's army burnt much of Holyrood, including its 400-year-old Augustinian Abbey, to the ground. Henry never got his hands on the infant Mary, who was sent to France for safety. She was raised as a princess in the court of the French king. She stayed in France for the next 13 years, finally returning to her native land in 1561. Mary was every inch the young queen. She was beautiful, she dressed elegantly, she was well educated, she spoke many languages, she played musical instruments. She was also athletic, she played golf, and she was always up for a few sets of cash pool, the French version of real tennis. But for Scottish Protestants, there was something about Mary, and it really got their goat. They condemned her for dancing, for dressing too elaborately, for indulging in sport. But what they couldn't forgive was that she was a Catholic. Mary was heading for trouble. Mary's first big mistake was to attend a Catholic Mass on her first Sunday back in Scotland. Her second was to fall in love with and marry her 19-year-old cousin, a womanising cad named Lord Darnley.
He was vain, arrogant, almost certainly bisexual, drunk half the time, and probably had contracted venereal disease within 6 months of the marriage.
Mary enraged her husband by hiring David Rizzio, a handsome, educated Italian, as her private secretary. Eventually, Darnley determined to act. He assembled a band of conspirators and led them by a secret route to the Queen's chambers. What happened that night?
They burst in on Mary's supper and dragged Rizzio away. Apparently he was clinging onto her skirts, and when he wouldn't come away, a pistol was put to Mary. They dragged him through to here and apparently stabbed him 56 times. This is where he lay, and these are supposed to be traces of Rizzio's blood. It was here that he lay and breathed his last.
What were they thinking about to commit such a brutal, bloody act?
One of the theories is that by performing such a violent act in front of the Queen, that she may miscarry the baby, and at that time that would almost certainly have meant death for her as well, leaving Darnley in charge of Scotland.
Darnley's evil plot failed. Mary reigned in Scotland for almost 25 years. Even though she was eventually beheaded by Elizabeth I, her son James would go on to do what no monarch of England or Scotland had done before: rule over both countries. What traces could we find of Mary here at Holyrood? She was regal and modern, and so very unlikely to be content with the palace that she inherited. And sure enough, she did her fair share of improvements at Holyrood. We knew she'd added formal gardens and, unsurprisingly, built a real tennis court. Rothermay's map shows us, tantalisingly, what it looked like and where it stood, just outside the main gates of the palace on the main road. The geophys results were superb, but unfortunately, not what we wanted.
We've been comparing it to the earlier Ordnance Survey mapping. A lot of the results do seem to line up with buildings on the earlier maps.
That's right. Well, these are the 1930s tenements, right enough, but there were tenements on the site prior to these.
From a geophysical perspective, I would say we put a trench across here, go through the later layers, get down to the earlier stuff.
Well, I wonder if we could have some sort of compromise, cut through this, or at least work out what it is, and get to this more ephemeral trace here.
Unfortunately, there was nothing ephemeral about these Victorian tenements. If Queen Mary's real tennis court was under here, we were having huge problems getting to it. Just how busy an area has this been, archaeologically speaking, in the centuries?
If you come here about 150 years ago, you wouldn't want to be standing here at night, because we were in one of the lowest parts of Edinburgh at that time, the bottom of the Canongate, full of tenements, Victorian tenements, slums. There were 3 pubs on the site, the Queen's Arms, the King's Head and the Crown and Cushion. There was a brothel thrown in. We'd have been standing in a wally close, a tile close, so you wouldn't want to come down here in your whites.
Yeah, you would look a little bit conspicuous with your wee tennis racket touched under your arm.
Yes.
The Victorian slums were more solid and time-consuming than we'd bargained for. It was touch and go whether we'd have enough resources to get through these levels and back to the 16th century. In London, too, there were a few red faces. Stuart had had the team spending the whole day searching for a garden wall, which was a crucial bit of evidence in our hunt for the earlier houses on this site.
Haven't we found it, Stuart?
No, short answer.
But you've been going all day.
Well, it's very confusing. We've got things that look like they might be service trenches for pipes, things like that. We've got layers of gravels, we've got some clay down there, but no wall. It looks as if the whole thing's been swept away when they landscaped for the later Buckingham Palace.
Yeah. This is so frustrating. They've probably got archaeology of national importance over at Windsor. Every time you get anywhere near something, you dig a trench and then you go, oh no, it's been swept away.
That's right.
Pretty depressing, isn't it?
Well, no, it's not really, because the finds are fantastic. This wee thing, look at that. That's a diamond piece of jewellery. It's made of gold, beautiful facets, it's quality stuff.
Date?
Don't know yet. We've gone to the Royal Jeweller to get a date from them.
That's not the only great find we've got. See, we've got loads of finds from a lot of different periods,
We
haven't
do, and lots of different places. Now, this one's a nice one. It's a good, solid bit of hard-wearing sandstone, I reckon, garden step.
It's very smooth as well, and it's well worn.
Yeah, Duke of Buckingham slippers might have worn that one. Lots of brick, we saw that earlier, but I've got a new favourite amongst the bricks. Look at this little beauty. Looks crusty, but there's a bit of clay pipe in there. You can see the brickmaker had a bit of backy, hasn't he? Thrown the pipe in, job's a good one.
What else we got?
Well, this I told you yesterday was German from the Rhineland.
Yeah.
It actually isn't. It's from Fulham in London.
Or the Fulham part of Germany.
Yes, that's right. Quite far north. There's a good story with that, though, because bear in mind, Arlington here, 1674. Buckingham's House, 1703. That was dated 1671 to 1703, made by John Dwight, who built up his factory as a direct rival to the German Westerwald work.
From all that, this is all palace period stuff.
Yeah.
we've still really only got a very little bit of evidence of the medieval period. And then
I know what you're here for.
Well, exactly. The point of it is, all the stuff that is here is from settled communities, people that are living here and they've got pots. This is the one piece of evidence of a group of people that were not settled, people that roamed around. This lovely little flint blade, I think it's probably Mesolithic, I think it's probably 6,000 or 7,000 BC. It's by far and away the oldest thing from Buckingham Palace.
It's frustrating, though, isn't it, that we've only got a couple of things from the pre-palace period.
Yeah, but we're working on that over here because we've had the corers working over here.
Yeah.
We're looking for the river. The river that came through here earlier
Tyburn,
on.
yeah.
The Tyburn, which we think had prehistoric settlements along it. Indeed, that piece of flint might have come from one of those settlements. So tomorrow we're going to be spending more time trying to look at that river and its valley to see if we can find some of those earlier settlements.
We only had a day left to resolve all three of these magnificent sites. The final day at Buckingham Palace. Very little time left to recreate the houses that stood here before the palace and even before Buckingham House. Although there were loads of maps and plans, they didn't all seem to match up.
That one has a cluster of buildings in it, this one has precisely nothing.
And you've got what's called Goring House. A picture of that is more like that, which is Arlington.
But as they got to grips with the archive, Stuart spotted one plan of special significance.
This is a detailed survey to do with the disputes. This shows Buckingham's house and these pavilions and so on. But it's almost like an archaeological survey because it shows the foundations that a guy called Flitcroft drew on here of the old house.
And this survey meant Stuart could look at the quadrangle in a whole new light.
The earlier Arlington house should be somewhere maintaining this symmetry. This is the crossbar of the H, with a long range going that way, and then another crossbar maintaining the symmetry up there.
With time short, our buildings team split up, with the incident room working on how the houses may have looked.
Square, it's very nice and neat. What you do is cut out that, and you end up with a plan that's really typical 1670s, much more rectangular, simple plan.
While Geophyz started the long, lonely task of surveying the quadrangle. But even with all the high-tech resources available, it was proving to be more difficult than we expected.
In many ways, too many plans. Some of them are artistic and some of them are proper plans. It's sorting the wheat out from the chaff.
But all the different maps and plans are going to be different sizes.
You've hit a big nail on the head with that statement.
But once we've got one measurement, we can start to tie everything together, and there's a lot of standing architecture still available for us to measure against.
As the day went on, Jimmy from Geophyz slowly but stoically completed his survey. Providing the last element for our merry band of virtual house builders.
I mean, look at all these potential wall lines. That's really exciting. I mean, there's so much at so many different levels.
Gosh, I mean, there's an awful lot going on in there, isn't there?
We'd already worked out exactly where Buckingham House stood, but could we now locate Arlington House on our plan?
Arlington House was H-shaped like this, and from the work we've done with the maps and Jimmy's radar survey together, and they tell the same story for a change, we can firmly place Arlington House just there.
It's so small, isn't it, compared with Buckingham Palace? It just sits snugly into the quadrangle of the house
But
nowadays.
it's a beautiful house, though, because we've got this wonderful 1698 inventory that tells us even in the garrets there were gilded leather hangings, there is a hall there with Denmark marble, even all the bedrooms had blue marble fireplaces.
Yeah, it's a lovely little house. But before that, there was an even smaller house, Goring House.
Yes, Goring House. That was rectangular in shape, and we've had more difficulty placing this, but the one thing we're certain is it was on a different alignment and under Arlington House, just like that.
Well, it's something rather simpler because, you know, in 1633, Goring had inherited a house from a guy called Mr. Blake, and he transformed it. So we think it's a bit more piecemeal.
Yes, it is quite stark, isn't it?
Yeah.
Does it tell us anything about the changing house styles in London generally?
Yes, it does. From those simple origins, there's really a change after the 1660s when Charles II totally renovates St James's Park, puts in canals and avenues, and they focus on this site. So after that period, it becomes the best address in London.
As the buildings experts were doing well in their quest for the lost houses, it meant the digging team were able to push further back into the history of these royal gardens. Could we get right back, even into prehistory?
We've got all these linear features, which I presume can only be cultivation.
I mean, there's always a distinct possibility. There's lots of things there we don't know about as well. There's Buckingham's Wall.
What, you mean they're not being mapped? Well, that's a first.
Bridge was finding much older material in Stuart's garden wall trench.
And this here, where we've got a cut running down along here, it's a cut feature on a slightly different alignment, but essentially going in that general direction
That's
again.
terrific, because that might give us that continuity of boundaries through here, which tells us something about not only the layout of Goring and Buckingham's gardens, but also something about the landscape beforehand. Fields, arable fields, a whole sort of agricultural landscape out here. This is terrific.
Eventually, we combined the archaeology with the map evidence and the geophys, and it turned out that this huge royal garden owed its shape not to lords and ladies, but to ancient farmers.
Well, in the medieval period, we've got plenty of evidence for strip fields, small arable fields, got patterns of them we can see. Now, one thing is quite clear, that when Lord Goring moves in here, he buys up the land and puts the boundaries of his garden along the existing fields. It's actually a multi-sided garden. What he's doing is putting his boundaries along pre-existing boundaries, as we found in Bridget's Trench. So what we're seeing is a landscape not shaped by great aristocratic design, it's shaped by the peasants who laid out those fields.
And before the medieval farmers, the Romans had put their hallmark on the landscape.
Really, it's the roads. The roads really changed the way that London looks.
The experts had delivered, but so had the diggers. Our auguring had confirmed that this site had been a prehistoric swamp, the floodplain of the River Tyburn.
We've got this very sort of dark reddish-brown sand, and that's replaced up there, but in between we've got this much paler...
Oh, that light band there?
Yeah, coarser sand.
And what's that tell you?
That would suggest that we've got a bit of a sort of flood event that deposited that, and that's evidence of a river or something like that being in the area.
The results were so good, the archaeologists were allowed the last word, with one final, very deep trench.
1.2. So we're aiming to go to basically 3.
Having worked our way through nearly 3 metres of backfilled demolition rubble from the earlier houses, we hit what looked like layers of river sand and gravel.
And that takes us right back to the Mesolithic period, the hunter-gatherer period, when there were communities wandering about through woodland and so on.
We'll never know if we found the River Tyburn, but thousands of years ago, the gardens were almost certainly marshy and home to hunter-gatherers who roamed around here in their search for food. The arrowhead that came up a couple of days ago could have been used by one of these people. In London, we had the oldest find from all 3 palaces. Up at Holyrood House Palace, they were still struggling with the most elusive, Mary Queen of Scots real or royal tennis court. We knew what it looked like, but sadly the Victorian tenements had stood firmly in our way.
This is supposed to be a tennis court, Francis. Where are the rackets and the tennis balls?
We haven't got balls, but we've got bottles. This is an old whiskey bottle, complete with its original cork.
Very nice.
We've got bits of glass. Well, basically what we got here is modern rubbish. So it does look like the Victorian buildings have completely trashed any evidence for the real tennis courts, if the evidence was there in the first place. We've looked very, very carefully, we've given it our best shot, and, you know, we haven't come up with the money.
For 2 days, we'd been scrambling about in the hydrangeas on the other side of the modern building, desperately trying to find the lost wing of the 15th century royal palace. It was swept away long ago, and our only guide was a rough floor plan. But the detective work had paid off, and I could now walk into James IV's palace.
Neil, you and I are standing in history, mate. We're standing in the stair turret up which James IV would have walked to get to his private bedchamber.
Take me round it.
Well, we've found the wall of the octagonal chamber, stair turret. It goes up here and then it turns an angle, and what we've done is we've laid out this wood on the ground to show where the stair turret was.
So this is the shape?
Yep.
So if we were in here, we would be standing on steps of a massive stone-built spiral
Huge
staircase.
thing.
The corner of the 15th century octagonal tower was clearly visible.
This is the pivotal detail that we're able to extrapolate the whole of the sort of layout of the Palace of James IV from that corner there where that turret is.
For centuries, antiquarians and archaeologists had only sparse documents to help them understand the royal annex buried under these gardens. So until now, they had no idea how large it really was. Finding these foundations meant we were able to work out the full dimensions of the buried building and how it linked up to the modern palace of Holyrood House. On the lawn, in the monastic trenches, Francis had also made a spine-tingling discovery, which suddenly hooked us back 500 years to one of Scotland's darkest moments.
What's all this bright colour coming in from?
I'll tell you, you come down here, jump across. Right. Well, you can see this beautiful orange layer here.
It looks like fired clay.
It is. That's exactly what it is. That is a result of an extraordinarily intense fire above it. You only get that in a hearth, a fireplace, that sort of thing, or, more to the point, when the building catches fire.
We're talking about an inferno, perhaps.
You are talking about an inferno. There are enormous beams hitting the floor, and that's what turns the soil on the floor bright orange. It's just the sheer heat of burning roof rafters. And that's what the charcoal is above here, this black stuff. Look.
The army that comes up here on behalf of Henry VIII and wrecks the town, amongst other things, he set fire to this place. Now, are you telling me that you've got that here in this little square?
When I saw it, sort of hair went up on the back of my neck. It was one of those moments.
That fire destroyed most of the monastery. A brutal desecration by Henry VIII, born out of revenge for being denied possession of the baby Mary, Queen of Scots. It was, though, just one of the many chapters of the history of this remarkable Scottish palace. A history better understood now than it was before our 3 days of investigation and digging. At Windsor, we'd made world-class discoveries. Our search in the upper ward for Edward III's round table had revealed a building, but there was little time to agree the design. Meanwhile, in the lower ward, the hunt for Henry III's Great Hall and adjacent royal chamber had shifted from the car park to a little alley.
So come this way with me.
In relocating the search, Tim had taken a huge gamble. But in a tiny keyhole trench...
Matt, how are you getting on?
Look at this, we've cracked it. Here, we have the clay base for a really nice floor, and here, we have what's left of the robbed-out wall.
Another robbed-out wall?
Yep, all the stone's been taken.
Tim?
We've got it as a robbed-out wall, but if you come with me, I can actually show you the wall itself sitting on top of it.
What, a real
it's
wall?
Right here, a real wall. Here is the wall, right here.
Hang on a minute, Tim. You're telling me we are standing in what was the Great Hall. This is the wall.
Exactly.
Let's just check this on the map.
Here we are. We move it down here to the curtain wall, though the block would have stayed back up here, and that's where the Great Hall is.
So that's our wall. OK, what was going on in this Great Hall?
Well, down the bottom end there would have been the buttery and the pantry, and that's
Yeah,
where
but
all
the
the
big
servants
wigs.
were.
What about the big wigs?
But if you follow me and we go round this corner here, this is where the dais was at the high end of the hall, and here's where the king sat.
And what about his queen? So here's where the important people were.
We came so close to missing it, but finally we proved that Henry III's Great Hall and chambers weren't in the middle of the castle site, but built right up against the outer wall of the castle's lower ward. Nearly 100 years later, in the upper ward, Edward III was putting up a huge building for his Knights of the Round Table. We'd found what looked like the walls and the chalk floor, but we didn't know if it had a roof or what exactly it was used for.
So you still think there's a lot of useful information coming out of these existing trenches?
Very useful indeed. I think we're getting to understand the nature of the building activity, and it looks as if we've got the surface they were actually building on. The evidence more and more is looking like a big masonry building with columns of stone and not timber, but still open in the middle.
You two must be royally chuffed. You've uncovered your round table building live on telly.
It's unimaginable. It's absolutely fantastic. It's not quite the forest of timber we thought, but there's a great array of stone columns and arches looking seriously large and very royal.
You've got the seats round the back for the night, and in front you've got a stone table on stone legs, and a big open space in the middle still.
What on earth was this used for?
It was a performance space, a theatre in the broadest sense.
What, a theatre with plays put on it?
With plays, reenactments, with scripts.
How extraordinary. Before Shakespeare, well before Shakespeare. What kind of plays?
They were the Arthurian romances. Edward and his knights acted out the Arthurian romances. A round table is a building, it's a round table, but it's also an occasion. And it's an occasion when you play parts, you act, and the knights become the Arthurian knights.
For hundreds of years, scholars had been searching for this enigmatic building, buried somewhere within the walls of the oldest occupied royal castle in the world. Archaeologists will be arguing the finer details for decades to come, what the floor was really made of, which knights took part, and why this ceremonial building was never completed by Edward III. But our three-day dig in 3 royal palaces was at an end. It had been a surreal but wonderful experience for us all. As for the finds, well, it was okay for them at Windsor with their world-grabbing headlines. Here at Buckingham Palace, we were very proud of our collection of old bricks and stones. And we had the Grenadier Guards to play us out.